This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. In July of 1972, 4 women met up in northern Italy, calling themselves the International Feminist Collective. In a statement, they declared, quote, "We identify ourselves as Marxist feminists and take this to mean a new definition of class, based on the subordination of the wageless worker to the waged worker, behind which is hidden the productivity, i.e. the exploitation, of the labor of women in the home and the cause of their more intense exploitation out of it," unquote. Thus, they saw the need to create an international women's group that would produce and share publications and would, quote, aim ultimately at joint mass actions transcending national borders, unquote. The International Feminist Collective didn't last long as an organization itself, but it planted the seed of what would become the International Wages for Housework campaign. 3 of the 4 women who met in Italy that July, Selma James in the United Kingdom, Maria Rosa della Costa in Italy, and Silvia Federici in the United States, would be major drivers of the campaign. Before the July 1972 meeting, James and della Costa already had a shared publication that would, over different editions and translations, help define the vision of the Wages for Housework movement. In 1953, Selma James, under the pen name Marie Brandt, had written a political pamphlet titled A Woman's Place, at the urging of her future husband, CLR James, in which she discussed the toil and stress of housework and motherhood, and how vulnerable women were, being dependent on both their husbands and their husbands' bosses for material support. When Maria Rosa della Costa was working on her own manifesto in the early 1970s, she consulted with James, whom she'd met in London. And when she published Women and the Subversion of the Community in March 1972, it was alongside an Italian translation of James's A Woman's Place. The two followed up with an English-language version of their book, titled The Power of Women and the Subversion of the Community, published by Falling Wall Press in Bristol. The book did not demand wages for housework, although in a footnote, James mentioned that the idea was getting traction. In fact, it was James, in a pamphlet distributed at the 3rd Women's Liberation Conference in Manchester in March 1972, who had argued, quote, "If we raise kids, we have a right to a living wage. The ruling class has glorified motherhood only when there is a pay packet to support it. We work for the capitalist class. Let them pay us, or else we can go to the factories and offices and put our children in their fathers' laps. let's see if they can make Ford cars and change nappies at the same time. We demand wages for housework. All housekeepers are entitled to wages. Men, too," unquote. In their speaking tour that followed the release of their English language book, James and Della Costa zeroed in on wages for housework as the core demand. By the mid-1970s, there were wages for housework groups in the United Kingdom, in Italy, and in the United States. Sylvia Federici convened the New York Wages for Housework Committee, which opened a storefront meeting space, published pamphlets, convened conferences, and participated in protests. In 1975, Federici published her classic text of the movement, Wages Against Housework, which opened, quote, "They say it is love. We say it is unwaged work," unquote. Federici, who was a PhD student in philosophy at the time, argued that housework is, quote, "the most pervasive manipulation, the most subtle and mystified violence that capitalism has ever perpetrated against any section of the working class," unquote. Because housework is not just unwaged and not just imposed upon women, but, quote, "it has been transformed into a natural attribute of our female physique and personality, an internal need and aspiration supposedly coming from the depth of our female character," unquote. Following the New York Wages for Housework Committee Welfare Conference in April 1976, organizers Wilmette Brown and Margaret Prescott launched an autonomous group, Black Women for Wages for Housework, declaring, quote, "Our group is a rainbow of Black women. Some of us are married, some are single, some of us have children, some don't. Some of us are straight, some are lesbian, some of us have second jobs, some are on welfare. Some of us are older, some younger. All of us want wages for housework," unquote. They weren't the first autonomous group. Wages Due Lesbians had launched in Toronto a few months earlier. The first action of Black Women for Wages for Housework was to fight for the right for college students on welfare to also receive tuition grants without losing their welfare benefits. After Prescott moved to the West Coast, she rallied Black Women for Wages for Housework to demand that the police investigate a wave of serial murders of young Black women and that they keep the public informed. When the police and media referred to the murder victims as prostitutes, Prescott responded, quote, "Every life is of value. We don't accept a hierarchy of human life," unquote. For Prescott, her work with Wages for Housework and her work organizing against serial murders were the same work, both the work of holding communities together. Today, Wages for Housework is called Care Income Now, launched in March 2020 under Global Women's Strike. On their website, they note, 50 years after the campaign originally launched, quote, "Women and girls do more than 3/4 of all unpaid care work, a total of 12.5 billion hours a day. The market values unwaged work at $10.8 trillion, but never suggests that those who do it should get any of it. Unpaid family carers, overwhelmingly women but also children, save governments billions, unquote. Joining me in this episode is Dr. Emily Kalachi, professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and author of Wages for Housework: The Feminist Fight Against Unpaid Labor.
I've got a friend in the kitchen who helps me a lot when I'm blue. Oh, she sweeps and cooks, not much on looks, but she's got the right point of view. I go to the kitchen when everything's wrong. I like her advice, so I'll pass it along. Just get yourself a broom and sweep your troubles away. Away. Just laugh at Mr. Gloom and keep a-going all day. And say, you'll make mistakes, but you don't have to stop. That is why pencils have rubbers on top. So get yourself a broom and sweep your troubles away. Stop weeping, keep sweeping. Get yourself a broom and sweep your troubles away.
Hi, Emily. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for inviting me on.
I want to start by asking, this is very different than your first book, so I want to hear a little bit about how you got interested in this topic, about writing about wages for housework. And this is a book that sort of spans not the whole globe, but more parts of the globe than your first book. So tell me a little bit about how you got interested in writing about this.
Sure, thanks. So as you mentioned, my background is in decolonization and African history, so a very different topic. I guess the connecting point would be kind of global history in the 1970s, so there was that kind of time period connection. But you're right, this was really a very different kind of project than I had been trained to do or had expertise in. And it really arose from the personal circumstances of my own life. I started getting interested in this topic after I had my first child. And, like so many new parents, you just suddenly, and nothing can really kind of prepare you for this, just have this massive, even calling it a second job kind of undercounts just how all-encompassing that work is. And, I'd grown up in the 90s, and I've always been a feminist, but I really kind of grew up with a feminism that really focused on career as the site of, feminist struggle, of liberation, very kind of middle-class idea about feminism. And I just, it just became so clear to me that this work was unencompassing, that it was happening everywhere around me. I started to notice it more once I was doing it myself. And it was totally not counted as part of the economy, not recognized as actual work. And where it was recognized as work, totally, underpaid and unvalued. And so, one of the things that I think many new parents face is you get all this parenting advice about how to manage this new workload. How do you have work-life balance? How can you be more efficient? Or how can you outsource some of that work onto lower paid people, And I found all that advice so frustrating and so narrow. And what I really wanted to understand was, as an historian, first of all, why do we actually do things this way? Like, how did we actually get to a position where so much of the vital work that makes our society run is not counted? And then more than that, I really wanted a more ambitious way of thinking about this. I didn't want a lifestyle hack. I wanted to actually think about how we might live differently. So that got me just looking into, how feminists of earlier generations had thought about this question of this, unpaid, essential care work. And so one of the first movements I encountered was this really, brilliant, creative, quirky little movement from the 70s called Wages for Housework. And I just was really fascinated by it.
You published this book with a trade press, and you yourself are in the book, not a lot, but some, as a researcher. I wanted to ask you about that experience of writing yourself into the story as researcher. I love that as a reader, but I imagine that's a little bit different than what you're trained to do as an academic historian. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Let's see. There are a few ways to think about that. Part of it was honestly that I'd apart from the nature of the topic, I had been thinking to myself, that I was really, I've always been really interested in writing and literature, right? And so I found myself getting frustrated having gone through the tenure process of just this directive to write in this one particular way, and I found myself really frustrated by just writing for my fellow colleagues and not when I felt like I had things to say to a broader range of people, right? So I even before this project wanted to start experimenting with how can we actually write, in a different kind of voice as historians. And I've since then started teaching creative historical writing classes, and I've really I edit a series at the AHR called History Unclassified, which is with my co-editor Kate Brown, that's about other genres of historical writing. So that's just kind of an interest of mine. But then also, particularly the topic of this book, I think I tried to figure out how can I write this in the way that would be most kind of, I don't know if convincing is the right word, but I wanted to, it didn't feel to me that the only mode of writing about this topic was as an expert, because it was something that I felt so much with my body, with my everyday life, right? And so I had to figure out how to write that in an authentic kind of voice, in a way that would, there's this line by the great nonfiction writer Vivian Gornick that says, for nonfiction writing to be compelling, you have to know who is speaking, not in the sense that you have to know every demographic detail about that person, but you have to know the spirit in which it's being written. So I felt that to write this book about something that was so personal, I had to put some of that on the table. I did feel like, if I'm writing about housework or unpaid work, and I'm traveling to all these archives and taking breaks every, couple of hours to breastfeed while my partner kind of pushes the baby around. And I mean, that can't be invisible from the book. I'd be participating in the very thing that I'm writing critically about, so yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that leads me to a question I have that I think the listeners might have, which is, what is, for this movement, housework? And that is a complicated question to answer, of course. So what all are we talking about when we talk about housework?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, like you say, a complicated question, one that changes over the course of this history. So initially, housework is, when it was first kind of politicized in this way by Salva James and Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, is the work that makes all other work possible. They were talking about, the kind of metaphor that Maria Rosa Dalla Costa uses in her kind of, classic text that she wrote starting this movement. If we're thinking about the working class and you just talk about the factory, right, and the assembly line and the workers who are creating value to be extracted by the capitalist class in the factory, you're missing a big part of that equation, and she says we have to imagine that the assembly line stretching outside the factory all the way into the worker's home, where there are people caring for that worker, preparing the food, keeping the house livable, getting him dressed, taking a more long-term perspective, raising future generations of workers, right? So that's the initial sense in which housework was kind of conceived, is how do you actually reproduce human society, at that level? As more people took up this idea of wages for housework, for example, Wilmette Brown, she had been a member of the Black Panther Party, who then became a member of Wages for Housework and started Black Women for Wages for Housework in the mid-'70s. She talked about, particularly how housework, it's not the same for everybody, right? She talked about the work of, raising families in places that are suffering from environmental racism. That's a very different kind of housework, right? You have to keep an environment livable for your kids when you're facing toxicity because of, pollution. Talking about protecting your kids from police violence, if, you're a Black family in a police surveilled place. So housework, starts off with this very kind of classic trying to understand how housework fits into capitalism. It extends into this kind of way of thinking about it as a way of living with capitalism, being able to make life livable in places that are in many ways unlivable. So, and then, Silvia Federici talks about emotional housework in a way, right? The work of having to perform heterosexuality if you're in a nuclear family situation where a roof over your head is dependent on your marriage to, a worker, that kind of making yourself pleasing, having to, do the emotional kind of housework of caring for people. So that's another way it's extended, is to think about, all those components of it. And there have been, criticism at some points in the movement where it's some people have pushed back and said, well, is everything housework? At some point, for example, if you decide to, put on lipstick in the morning because there is social pressure on you to do so, should we put a price on that? There was this movement of stewardesses who wrote to Maria Rosa Dalla Costa talking about the emotional work of having to keep the passengers calm, and thinking about that as housework. So there's a point at which it kind of spins into, a really kind of capacious category, and I think some might say we have to know what it is before we politicize it. But I think some of that rethinking of housework in all these different spheres is actually really interesting and generative.
Speaking of capacious, it's often unclear in the story, in the history, what the demands of the movement are.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? What the demands are or aren't, or if the movement know what the demands are, and the tension that creates?
Sure. Yeah. So maybe the way to start answering that question is to talk about one of the first major or the biggest critiques of the movement, right? Is you're talking about the 1970s, what we sometimes call second wave feminism, where there's just massive movement around the world of women getting together to talk about women's liberation and talking about women's rights. And one of the, major components of that is being able to resist traditional, gender roles and to resist the role of the housewife, the freedom to pursue work and financial autonomy outside the home. And so one of the big kind of criticisms of wages for housework was that you are basically essentially entrenching that category of housewife when you demand payment for it, right? You're basically saying, we want to be housewives and we want to be paid for it, like that seemed really counterintuitive at that time, and it still seems counterintuitive. The response that wages for housework had to that is, you can't actually address this form of exploitation, this particular problem, without talking about money, without actually addressing that. And, secondly, for people of middle class people who are educated, like who have access to, careers that are rewarding, that bring some kind of personal, satisfaction, work might mean liberation. But for the vast majority of women, working class women, poor women, historically women of color, getting, the idea of going out into the workplace has not always been associated with liberation, right? It's not liberating to go and work at a fast food restaurant for minimum wage while also doing care work, right? So to center so much on work in that way, really, one, is elitist, but then two, distracts from this broader problem, which is that we're all doing all this work that's essential for society to function that's unrecognized. So for this to be out in the open, you have to demand payment for it, or you have to at least, recognize its critical, place in the economy. And there was a lot of debate within the movement about whether this was a literal demand for money or whether this was a provocation, right? And I think that people come down on different sides of this, and Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, who I mentioned, she even said in her first kind of major manifesto that becomes in some ways the kind of core text of wages for housework and in spreading it, she says, we're not demanding wages for housework. That would actually just put us back in the home. And then in a subsequent publication that she co-edited with Selma James, it says, actually, no, we need to demand wages for housework because you can't talk about this without talking about money. And actually, putting money in women's pockets may not solve the problem, but it's a good first step to then organizing ourselves and demanding more. So that's probably, as you point out, the biggest tension in the movement is this actually a literal demand for money? Is it a provocation? Is it a way to demonstrate how capitalism actually is not as efficient as it says it is? If you actually put a price on the stuff that is, usually taken for free, then do you show actually what the real cost of this is?
Yeah, I thought that was one of the most interesting moments. It happens more than once in this history, and perhaps the moment we're living in right now brings it to the fore again, is this idea that when there are austerity measures put in place, that they can be put in place by a government because they know that the work will be done anyway, and it will be
Yes.
done unwaged by women.
Yeah, I found that I found that ingenious when I first read this. I hadn't thought about it that way when I first started the research, but I remember the moment that I kind of linked this with the politics of austerity. It was as wages for housework. They had all these global branches, and one of them was in Guyana, led by this activist Andaye, and she talked about wages for housework in terms of structural adjustment policies. Policies that insist that governments in the global South cut their budgets, slash social services, as a way of proving they're more, efficient economically and, as a condition for bank loans. And she said, just as you say, like this is portrayed as, belt tightening, as kind of like fiscal responsibility. But what it actually is freeloading, because what we know is that when you cut health services, when you cut education, it's not that, there's no need to care for the sick anymore. It's not that we're not educating children anymore or caring for them. It's that women step in and do that work for free, And that's in the 1980s when you have Thatcherism in Britain and then Reaganism in the US and the whole idea of the welfare queen and slashing welfare rolls. Wages for housework was really making an argument as an alternative to austerity, talking about, actually like this is not fiscal responsibility. This is, coercive labor. This is, extracting labor for free.
We're talking about the ways that this movement is saying to the larger women's movement, you need to think a little bit more broadly about what it means to be liberated,
Yeah.
what it means just getting, going out into the workforce is not necessarily liberation. But there are, of course, even within this movement, various strands, and women who are coming from themselves, different backgrounds, are thinking about wages for housework in different ways. Can you talk about these different strands? There's the sort of Italian part of the movement, and then there is a Black women for wages for housework. And there become tensions between these different parts of the movement, even if they have sort of the same overall idea of what they're looking for, because they're coming from different backgrounds, experiencing different things, reacting against different cultures. That leads to then tensions in the way they want to proceed.
Yeah, right. So I decided to tell the story of this movement through the story of 5 women who I think all contributed something really distinctive to the thinking behind wages for housework. So the first of them was Salma James, and she was born in 1930 in, radical Jewish working class Brooklyn. Her dad organized for the Teamsters Union. Her mother organized, rent strikes. So she grew up around radical politics. And she really saw herself as kind of a working class warrior fighting the class struggle. And she joined a kind of offshoot of the Socialist Workers' Party, as a young teenage woman at the height of McCarthyism, and she was organized. She married C.L.R. James, the great Trinidadian, Marxist thinker. And as she's going along doing all this organizing, on behalf of working class people, she really has an interest in working class women. And she defines working class women not just as those with jobs, but people like her mother who are doing the work in the neighborhood and in the home. So this is a longstanding interest of hers. So she ends up in London, in the 50s and 60s. And, long story short, when the feminist movement kind of, takes off in the early 1970s in the UK, she really sees it as an extension of this working class struggle she had been doing her whole life. She didn't see this as an aberration or a different kind of movement. She's like, yes, women are the working class. We do so much of the world's work. So that's one kind of branch of this. A second is Maria Rosa Dalla Costa. She grew up, in post-World War II Italy at a time of massive industrialization. And, in the 1960s, she's like a student militant with some of the uprisings on campus. And there are all these wildcat strikes around the factories in northern Italy. And a real focus on the left on the male worker, working for Fiat and all these other industrial companies as the protagonist of social change. And she is a part of that movement. And she says, we're missing a big part of that picture if we just focus on the male worker. I talked before about this metaphor of the assembly line. She really wants to extend that to incorporate women's work. So that's her kind of major shift, is talking about that Italian context of industrialization and the worker struggle. So the third person I read about is Silvia Federici, probably the most well-known of these figures to people. Her texts are still read by college students, and you see her quotes on graffiti and T-shirts and stuff. But she also grew up in post-World War II Italy. Oral history interviews I've done with her and that I've heard, other interviews. She really grew up, at a time when, it's central Italy. There's a real kind of post-Mussolini, patriarchal, Catholic kind of culture. And Silvia Federici is this really brilliant, rambunctious, tomboyish kind of young woman who really kind of chafes against those gendered expectations that she sees kind of coming down the pike for her as she's growing up. So she flees that. She comes to the U.S. to get a PhD in philosophy, and she ends up becoming one of the really eloquent spokespeople for wages for housework in terms of talking about resisting that push into the nuclear family, getting kind of conscripted into this, gender role. And she also, as I should mention, was getting a PhD in philosophy. So she also had a very academic kind of contribution to it as well. Wilmette Brown, so I mentioned her before. She, grew up in Newark, New Jersey, and, later in Berkeley joined the Black Panther Party. She was a Black lesbian woman, so she ended up leaving the Panthers largely out of frustration with the gender politics of the Panthers. And when she started Black Women for Wages for Housework, in New York in the 1970s, she really expanded the conception of housework, as I talked about before, to consider racial capitalism, to think about how unpaid work was not just about, the post-World War II nuclear family, factory worker and his wife, but had to incorporate histories of the slave trade and slavery and incorporating histories of imperialism, right? And then later, thinking about environmental racism and how the environmental crisis differentially affected Black women. So she really extended to thinking about it to consider those race politics as central to it. And then Margaret Prescott is the fifth person I read about in my book. And she was born and grew up in Barbados, and a relatively poor community. And one of the things that she witnessed a lot in her childhood is so many of the women in her community, women and men, traveled abroad to work in the global north as domestic workers, as low-paid, basically care workers. So she could see this kind of extraction of labor, from her community. Many of the women abroad were, having other people raise their children because they had to go and get money, in working in London and New York and other places. So when she moved to New York and as a teenager, despite having, witnessed this growing up, when she gets to the US, by contrast, she encounters this political rhetoric which says, oh, immigrants are freeloaders. Oh, welfare mothers are freeloaders. When it was totally clear to her that the opposite was true. She had watched this labor be exploited, So she really brought this global perspective to Wages for Housework, thinking about it in terms of immigration and imperialism and those dynamics. So they had these really different experiences of housework, different political backgrounds that they brought to this. And I found that so exciting because to me, as you point out, it really took this initial kernel of an idea about, thinking about housework as part of the capitalist system, and taking it from the kind of nuclear family, conventionally conceived workers' family, and then thinking about it in all these different settings. It really, became a very capacious politics for thinking about the work that we value and the work that we invisibilize and, extract for free in our society. You also talked about some of the differences that they had, and I'm not sure I could chalk them up entirely to their different backgrounds, although certainly that came up. The movement split apart in the late 70s, and I think all 5 of the women I've just described would maybe have a different story about why that happened. One of them has to do with basically what was happening in the late 70s, and you have like Reaganism and Thatcherism and the real rise of kind of conservative backlash that's cutting all these programs. And so a lot of people at that point thought, well, we've kind of lost the battle, let's direct our energies elsewhere. That was what a lot of people told me. In Italy, there was a huge repression against the left at that time. Maria Rosa Dalla Costa was one of only very few people in her department that were not arrested, for their political activities, right? So that put it really pushed a lot of stuff underground. But then another factor was involved. It was, again, a real kind of split within the people in this movement who disagreed about how to do this politics. And, one of the things that's been challenging about my book is trying to figure out how to tell everyone's version of the story, but not being able to, through my archival research, basically take a side. That's not something I was able to do through the research I was doing. So Silvia Federici and Dalla Costa, they talk about real differences in terms of how they imagined a social movement should work, with Dalla Costa and Federici really having an idea about a really kind of decentralized kind of movement where people could kind of form their own kind of Wages for Housework group. They would talk to each other, but there would be this real kind of decentralized way it would unfold. And they were frustrated with Selma James, who they accused of having a very kind of hierarchical top-down model of how to organize, perhaps coming from some of her political background, or I don't know. But that was the kind of frustration they had, was feeling that there was this real kind of attempt to control the movement. But then another really kind of important part of the story has to do with race and racism. So Wilmette Brown, and I think Wilmette Brown and Margaret Prescott have been careful over the years about how they talk about it. So it's only more recently that they've gone on the record talking about it. But Wilmette Brown talked about trying to organize around, for example, welfare rights, and finding it really difficult to organize with white women in the campaign in New York because their failure to recognize that race was not just a kind of side category, but central to this question. And she describes that as the reason why they had to form Black Women for Wages for Housework, to have their own group where they could actually fully explore that politics, and actually pursue it. And they worked together with Selma James, who had a lot of experience doing that kind of work. Again, I mentioned she was married to CLR James. She had been doing a lot of anti-racist work in London at that time as well. And then Margaret Prescott, more recently, has, said, publicly a few times that she personally experienced racism from some members of the campaign, although, she's not pointing fingers at, she hasn't named as far as I know, but she shared that as part of her experience, so of course that's an important part of the story as well.
Where does this stand now? What does the shape of this campaign look like in the present day? Things have obviously changed tremendously politically since the late 1970s, and yet we do not have wages for housework in any countries currently. So what is the current push that people are making?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. And then I should mention that much of my writing and researching this book happened during the pandemic, and there was this back when I was on what used to be known as Twitter, I remember seeing this little tweet once that was like, everyone was tweeting about WFH, working from home and kind of joking about what it's like to work from home. And I saw someone, I don't know who said something like, oh, WFH, I wish this really meant wages for housework. Because it was this moment when suddenly there was and it was unavoidable to actually look at this work, because it was literally on your screen. I mean, like, when your kids are home from school and you're trying to zoom into a meeting, like you can just see it, So I think that was a moment of, I don't want to mistake the fact that I became really interested in that moment with the idea that everyone became interested in that moment. But it does seem to me like it was this turning point in terms of this interest in this topic and revisiting these politics. So, in the kind of wake of that, the core members who are still doing this work now, that are in the original group that was formed in London, they have started a campaign, or rather renamed the campaign Care Income Now. I think trying to update the idea of wages for housework to have a more kind of expansive way of describing that work. And they are talking about care income, both in terms of the conventional ways we thought about it, like in terms of caring for children, maintaining households, connecting to the welfare rights movement, our right to kind of care for people. And they've also extended it to include a call for caring for the planet as well, talking about all the kinds of care work that we're faced with, particularly when faced with climate crisis. So, for example, some of the people that they're involved with are working in India and in Thailand, in places where there is this pressure to privatize land and turn it into an extractive industry, mining, deforestation. And, they're talking about the rights that people have to actually care for that land, both in terms of protecting the planet and protecting their livelihoods, right? So extending, I think for them, calling that a care income, is maybe a little more evident than calling that housework, right? And equally important, and trying to relate those two kinds of work together, because they both are works that are necessary for sustaining life and for caring for our community and our planet. And they're both things that are under threat, in a capitalist economy that seeks to kind of monetize and sort of, extract profit from everything.
I think there are perhaps people who are newly interested in political activism. Are there lessons from this campaign that maybe places they found success, types of political activism they did that may be instructive for people who are thinking about political activism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, as you pointed out, a few minutes ago, one of the things a question I get a lot is, did they succeed? And of course, we don't have wages for housework. And in many ways, the situation might be worse than it was then, right? So, there's a long arc to the influence of these kind of movements. But I think the fact that these ideas are getting this, so much interest right now, you see similar ideas talked about, for example, in calls for universal basic income, right? You have all these pilot programs now that are prioritizing letting new parents care for their children, as part of this kind of broader attempt to de-link income with a paid wage job, in the marketplace. You can see, for example, in calls for a Green New Deal, talking about how do we actually invest in the kinds of activities that promote human thriving, right? And rather than, extraction and mass consumption, right? Why don't we prioritize someone who cares for a human body or soul rather than somebody who finds a new widget to make us think we want, right? So I think the ideas are really powerful. And that, I think, was my main interest, was thinking about this as a really powerful set of political ideas. In terms of organizing, there's a principle that they talk about a lot that I think is quite useful, not just in that movement, but in other movements, which is this idea they talk about autonomy, which is the idea that we all have a different relationship to the systems that exploit us. Like in the case of wages for housework, it is different to be a middle-class woman in the suburbs with a CEO husband. You're exploited, of course, but that's a very different kind of exploitation than being, say, a single mother who's having your welfare benefits cut, right? So how do you find a way, bring these people together, showing what they have in common, but not silencing one over the other? Because one of the things we see often in the history of feminism is how, even despite efforts to be inclusive, it so happens that the interests and demands of those at the top are the ones that always end up being centered, right? So how do you actually create a politics that doesn't do that, And I think the intention of autonomy was to find a way beyond that different groups would have a way to think about how they relate to this issue, but have a sense of being accountable to other groups within the movement, So there was one group that was fighting as lesbian mothers to defend their custody of their children, right, against a state that was homophobic and, calling them unfit mothers, like they didn't want to be drowned out by joining the mainstream movement, but they wanted to contribute to it because they saw they had something in common with other women in that movement. So I think that as an organizing principle seems to me really vital right now, particularly given how divided the left has been in this country. In other countries as well, and if there's a way that we can support each other by recognizing, our common enemies and also what we share and, as people who want to be liberated, I think that's a really powerful lesson. So, it's exciting to see people taking that up in some ways.
So I want to encourage listeners to read this book. How can they get a copy?
Sure. It should be available in bookstores in the U.S. as of March 18th. And I encourage everyone to support your local indie bookstore because we need to support them right now. And that's where you can get a copy.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for speaking with me. I loved reading this book, and it's been really fun to talk to you about this movement.
Thank you so much.
Drink and be merry, leave trouble behind. Buy a tin cup, it's a sin you'll go blind. So get yourself a broom and sweep your troubles away. Stop weeping, keep sweeping. Get yourself a broom and sweep your troubles away. You go to college, you know how you work. Then you get $10 a week as a clerk. So get yourself a broom and sweep your troubles away. Stop weeping, keep sweeping. Get yourself a broom and sweep your troubles away. Away.
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. Please subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app. You can find the sources used for this episode in a full episode transcript at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions, corrections, praise, or episode suggestions, please email kelly@unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and tell everyone you know. Bye!